broken faucet is almost adorable.
I don't know
Why you're doing this?
Squirm.
The night my parents finally called me wasn't soft. It wasn't a warm check-in or a casual, "How have you been?" It was the kind of call that makes your stomach go cold before you even answer. Like your body already knows this isn't about love. The caller ID said home, like it always had. But home hadn't been home for me in years. And when I picked up, I didn't hear my mother's voice first. I heard chaos. Breathing that sounded like someone had just run a mile. A chair scraping. My father's voice breaking in a way I'd never heard in my whole life. They were yelling, not at me, not at each other, at the air, at reality, at something none of them could believe. The only words I could make out were the ones my mother kept repeating like a glitch in her brain. "You're joking. You're joking. You're joking." And for a second, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because in a weird way, it was poetic. After all the years of them calling me dramatic, sensitive, too much, too quiet, to something, now they were the ones unraveling. Now they were the ones sounding like the world had turned upside down. Funny how that happens when the person you've ignored your whole life disappears on their own terms. I could picture them without even being there. My mother in her robe with her hair pinned up like she never had time to be messy. My father standing stiffly near the dining table, the same table where he used to praise my brother like a golden trophy. And my brother, Ethan, probably pacing, half angry and half scared. Because the family equation had always been simple. Ethan mattered and I was the spare part. But tonight, that equation had a crack in it. And the crack had my handwriting all over it. Because a letter had arrived. A letter I had written months earlier, sealed and left behind before I walked out of their lives. A letter I'd told myself they might never open. Or if they did, they'd skim it the way they skimmed me. But clearly they'd opened it now because something inside had detonated. You want to know what I left in that letter that made the house I grew up in finally shake? Then we have to go back. Not to the phone call. Not to the screaming. Back to the beginning when I still believed love was earned by being the easiest kid in the room. Back to the quiet corners of my childhood, where I learned the hard way what it feels like to live in a family that cheers for one child and tolerates the other. So let's rewind. Way before the letter. Way before I stopped waiting for them to see me. Back to how it all started. Welcome, story lovers from Where Are You Watching? Drop your city name in the comments so we can see how far our story travel. I was the second pancake. You know how the first pancake gets all the love? Carefully poured, watched like a hawk, flipped with ceremony. The second one gets tossed on the griddle because someone's already hungry. It's not that it tastes worse. It's just nobody's paying attention anymore. That was me. I arrived 3 years after Ethan, the family's first pancake. The proof my parents could do something right. Ethan was a bright, wide-shouldered kid with a jawline that somehow always looked like it belonged on a cereal box. He was the kind of child strangers complimented in grocery stores. He made adults laugh without trying. He yelled when he was happy, cried loudly when he was sad, and nobody ever told him his feelings were too much. They called him spirited, which is just a nicer way of saying the world had already decided to forgive him. I was quieter. Not shy, exactly. More like observant. I watched my parents the way other kids watched cartoons. I learned early what made my mother glow and what made my father tense. I learned that the house had an emotional thermostat and Ethan controlled it. If Ethan brought home an A, it was a celebration. If he brought home a B, it was a pep talk. If I brought home an A, it was expected, almost suspicious, like I cheated the system. If I brought home a B, my father would sigh the way people sigh when a car won't start. Like he couldn't believe he'd gotten stuck with a defective model. The favoritism wasn't loud at first. It rarely is. It's tiny things that add up until they become your reality. The way my mother posted Ethan's photos on the fridge but kept mine in a drawer. The way my father remembered Ethan's soccer schedule but couldn't tell you what grade I was in without checking. The way family friends would ask Ethan about his dreams and then pat my head like a pet, saying I was sweet for not causing trouble. Sweet. That word followed me like a leash. And I tried to be sweet because sweet meant safe. Sweet meant I wouldn't make my parents' already busy world harder. Sweet meant I might get a smile, a real one, not the polite kind adults give to strangers' kids. By middle school, I had turned being invisible into an art form. I ate lunch fast so nobody had to wait on me. I folded my own laundry before my mother could ask. I learned to read the air in a room like some kids learn to read Harry Potter. But invisibility is a bargain you think you're making with the world. You think if you shrink enough, the world will eventually reward you for being easy. What happens instead is the world forgets you were ever there. When I was 13, I made the honor roll and got invited to a district awards night. It was the kind of banquet where kids wear stiff dresses and parents clap too loudly into plastic cups of punch. The letter came home in my backpack. I left it on the counter in front of my parents, the way kids do when they're trying to pretend they don't care. Ethan was sprawled on the couch, bragging about a tournament he'd won. I waited for someone to notice the envelope. My mother walked past it twice before she finally picked it up. She opened it, skimmed, and smiled in that distracted way she smiled when she was already thinking about the next thing. "That's nice, honey. Proud of you." She said it without looking up, without even asking when the ceremony was. I told her the date anyway. She nodded, already halfway into the pantry. That night, the refrigerator door had a fresh new magnet with Ethan's tournament photo. My award letter ended up on top of the microwave under a stack of coupon flyers. I went to the awards night alone. A friend's mom drove me. When my name was called, I stood on the stage and scanned the room anyway. Old habits die hard. I didn't see my parents. I didn't see Ethan. I only saw a sea of clapping strangers and a few bright camera flashes from people who wanted proof they'd supported their kids. After I went home and put the certificate in my closet, nobody asked how it went. That was the first time I felt something in me harden. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet understanding there would be no finally they see me moment. Not unless I created it myself. High school was more of the same, just bigger stakes. Ethan ran track, and my parents became the kind of people who wore school colors in public. My mother begged for fundraisers. My father talked to coaches like they were old friends. The whole house revolved around Ethan's competitions. When he won, the family basked in it. When he lost, the family mourned it. When he got recruited to a decent college, my parents walked around like they'd personally been drafted into the NBA. Meanwhile, I was the kid who got good grades. Did extracurriculars, mostly stayed out of trouble. I taught myself graphic design for fun. I built a little side hustle fixing neighbors' computers. I wrote essays that made teachers cry. But at home, those things were background noise. There was one moment that still stings when I think about it. Senior year, a scholarship committee emailed me. I'd won a full ride to a private university 3 states away. It wasn't Ivy League, but it was a dream for a kid like me. I ran into the living room, waving the email like a lottery ticket. My father looked up from the TV. "What's that?" "A scholarship. Full ride. I don't have to take loans. I can go." He blinked like I'd said something in another language. That's good. Asterisk then, his eyes slid back to the game. Ethan sprawled in a beanbag, grinned and said something sarcastic about me leaving the house and finally making room for his trophies. My mother laughed. She didn't mean to hurt me. That's the worst kind of hurt, the kind wrapped in innocence. Later that week, my parents threw Ethan a graduation party. Not me, Ethan, because he was going to college too, and his college was a big deal. His friends came, the track team came, relatives came. My mother made a speech about how proud she was to watch her son become a man. People clanged glasses. I stood in the corner holding paper plates and pretending I didn't care. I went to my own graduation without a party. My mother said we were too tired to do 2 things. She hugged me in the driveway and told me I was low maintenance, like it was a compliment. When I left for college that fall, I packed my entire life into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. My parents helped Ethan move into his dorm with a rented SUV, a cooler full of snacks, and a laminated checklist. For me, they handed me a gas card and told me to be safe. I drove away listening to the same playlist on loop, trying to convince myself this hurt was normal, that all families were imperfect. that my parents were busy, stressed, human, that maybe I was imagining it. But imagination doesn't explain why your phone stays silent for weeks unless you call first. Imagination doesn't explain why your mother's texts are always about Ethan's newest achievement. Imagination doesn't explain why nobody asks about you unless they need something. College was my first taste of air. I wasn't Ethan's sister there. I wasn't the quiet kid in the corner. I was just me. And me, outside that family ecosystem, turned out to be ambitious, funny, sharp. Stubborn in a way I didn't know I was allowed to be. I made friends who listened. Professors who noticed. I worked part-time in the campus IT lab, then got a paid internship with a small tech company. For the first time, I got praised for things I did, not for how little space I took up. Still, I tried. God, I tried. Every break, I went home. Every holiday, I showed up with gifts and stories. I talked about my classes, my internship, my ideas for the future. My parents nodded and said whom while scrolling on their phones. The conversation always drifted back to Ethan. Ethan was struggling with a class. Ethan was switching majors. Ethan might go for grad school. Ethan had a new girlfriend. Ethan had a breakup. Ethan was thinking of moving back home for a while. Even in my own life updates, I was a side character. The summer after sophomore year, my father called me. I remember being surprised because he never called. I answered like it was an emergency. Hey, your brother needs a laptop for school. Yours is decent, right? I thought he was joking. No, Dad, I need mine for my internship. He sighed, irritated. You can get another one. He needs it more. That sentence lodged into my ribs. He needs it more. More than what? More than me. More than my work. More than my future. I said no again, softly, politely, the way I'd been trained. My father's voice hardened. Don't get selfish. Family helps family. It was funny in a bleak way. Family helps family. But helping had always meant helping Ethan, helping him study, helping him move, helping him feel better, helping him chase whatever dream he currently wanted. I was family only when family needed something. I kept my laptop. My father didn't speak to me for a month. My mother texted me that I should be more understanding because Ethan was under pressure. I began to understand something else instead. The rules in our family weren't universal. They were directional. They flowed toward Ethan like gravity. By graduation, I had a job offer in another state. A real salary, benefits? The kind of quiet success that doesn't look flashy on social media but changes your whole life. I told my parents on a Sunday call. My mother congratulated me the way you congratulate a coworker you barely know. My father asked if the state had good football teams. Then he paused. So you'll be far away. Yeah, he cleared his throat. Who's going to help your mother with Ethan if he moves back? There it was again. Not will you be okay, not are you excited, not I'm proud. Just the family logistics as if I were a utility. I said I didn't know. After the call, I sat on my dorm bed and stared at the wall for a long time. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't cry. I just felt tired in a way sleep can't fix. That tiredness followed me into adulthood. I moved, I worked. I built a life. I made friends who became family. I dated people who asked me about my day and waited for the answer. I started saving money not because I dreamed of being rich, but because I wanted a cushion, a way out, a way not to need anyone's permission to survive. But every year, the same patterns returned. Ethan needed help with rent. Ethan needed a car repair. Ethan needed a bailout after he quit another job. Ethan wanted to find himself and needed support while doing it. My parents would call me to guilt me into helping. They always sounded like I owed him a debt I'd never agreed to. Sometimes I helped, because I still had that old stupid hope in me that being good enough would finally earn real love. Sometimes I said no, and every no was treated like a betrayal. The last straw came on my 28th birthday. I've flown home for a weekend because my mother had been getting older. And part of me still wanted to do the dutiful daughter thing. We went out for dinner. Ethan was there, of course, because Ethan always had a seat at the table. The night was okay at first. Then my father announced that they were taking out a loan to help Ethan open a small business. Something vague. Something exciting. Something he'd probably abandon in 6 months. My mother turned to me, eyes bright. And we thought maybe you could contribute too. You're doing well, right? I froze. I wasn't doing bad, but I wasn't their bank. I asked how much. The number was big. Bigger than what I'd saved for myself, bigger than what I'd ever spent on anything besides survival. I said I couldn't. The air went still. Ethan laughed and rolled his eyes. My father's face tightened like a knot. You always make everything about you. Then he said it. Your brother has more potential. He just needs support. You don't need it like he does. Potential. The word that had been used like a crown on Ethan's head my whole life. A word that somehow meant my own efforts, my own quiet grind, weren't real. Something in me snapped, but not in a loud way. I nodded. Okay, after dinner, my mother asked if I was upset. I said no, because saying yes would mean another exhausting cycle of her defending Ethan. I went to bed in my childhood room and stared at the ceiling until morning. By sunrise, I'd made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like breathing. I was done auditioning for love. I bought a plane ticket that afternoon. I packed while everyone was at work. I looked around the room that had held my whole childhood and realized it didn't hold me anymore. Before I left, I wrote a letter. Not a text. Not an email. A real, old-school letter. The kind that makes you sit with your thoughts and take responsibility for every word. My hands shook while I wrote it. Not because I was scared of what I'd say. Because I knew once it existed, I couldn't pretend anymore. I wrote the truth. About being second. About feeling unseen. About living in a house where my worth was measured against my brother's whims. About how I'd tried to be easy, tried to be sweet, tried to be helpful. And none of it had changed the fact that they didn't look my way unless Ethan's orbit needed stabilizing. I told them I loved them. Because I did. I told them I couldn't stay in a family where I was always the unpaid intern. The quiet backup plan. The tool to fix their golden child's mess. I told them I was leaving. Not for a week. Not for a break. Leaving. And here's the important part. I told them not to call me until they were ready to talk about me as a full human being. Not an accessory to Ethan's story. I sealed it in an envelope and left it on the kitchen table. Then I walked out and closed the door softly behind me. Not because I was being polite, because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of a slam. I expected anger. I expected them to mock me, to say I was being dramatic, to blame me for being too sensitive. What I didn't expect was silence. Weeks passed. Then months. No calls, no texts, no email, just the occasional social media post from my mother about Ethan's business launch, Ethan's new chapter, Ethan's bravery. The letter had done what I knew it might. It had been ignored. And the thing about finally leaving a place that never fought for you is that you grieve twice. First, for what you lost. Then for what you never had. Still, I didn't go back. Instead, I built. Leaving my family didn't magically make my life easier. It just made it mine. At first, the freedom felt like walking into sunlight after years in a dim room. I didn't have to do the emotional math anymore. I didn't have to rehearse how to explain my choices. I didn't have to steel myself for casual little cuts disguised as jokes. But freedom also comes with echoes. There were nights I'd cook dinner and instinctively set out 2 plates before remembering I lived alone. There were mornings I'd check my phone expecting a text that didn't exist. There were moments I'd hear good news at work and my first thought would be to call my mom. Then I'd remember the agreement I'd made with myself. No calling until they're ready to see you. So instead, I poured my energy into the one place that had always rewarded effort, work. My job was in systems design for a mid-sized tech firm. Not glamorous, not Silicon Valley flashy, but solid. I liked the problem solving. I liked the quiet satisfaction of fixing something nobody else could see, but everyone benefited from. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my life being unseen labor. Now I was being paid for it. My manager noticed quickly. She was a blunt woman with a soft heart, the kind of leader who doesn't do fake compliments. She started giving me bigger projects. I've led small teams. I got promoted. I started speaking more in meetings without apologizing first. I wasn't trying to prove anything to my family, not consciously. But there's a certain fire that gets lit when you stop begging for validation and start building it yourself. A year after I left, I bought a small house. Nothing huge, just a neat little 2-bedroom with a porch and a backyard big enough for a garden. My friends helped me paint the living room. We drank cheap wine and laughed at how adult it felt to argue over curtain colors. I didn't tell my parents. Not because I wanted to be cruel, because information is a kind of intimacy. And they hadn't earned intimacy with me lately. Meanwhile, through the grapevine of relatives and social media, I saw more of Ethan's story unfold. His business was struggling, then booming, then struggling again. He moved back home temporarily. He crashed a car. He posted vague motivational quotes about hustle. My parents defended him online like PR agents. Every time I saw something, I felt two things at once. Relief that I wasn't inside that storm anymore, and a weird, stubborn ache that they still hadn't asked about me. Then came the phone call from my Aunt Linda. She was my mother's older sister, a woman who called a spade, and a mess, a mess. I hadn't spoken to her much since leaving, but she had always been the one adult in my childhood who would pull me aside at family gatherings and whisper that she saw how hard I tried. "Honey, how are you really?" "Fine," I said, because old reflex. She didn't buy it. "Your mom is... she's worried." She doesn't say it out loud, but she's not okay. I felt my spine stiffen. "Why are you telling me this?" Linda inhaled. "Ethan got into trouble. Real trouble. Not the usual kind. I don't know all the details, but it's serious. They're scared. And your dad. Well, your dad is acting like the roof is caving in." There it was. The gravitational pull again. I stayed quiet. Linda kept going. "I'm not calling to guilt you. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know what's going on, even if they don't have the courage to tell you." I asked what kind of trouble. She said there were lawsuits. Money missing. Investors angry. Different versions of the story depending on who you asked. But all roads led to the same conclusion. Ethan had finally sprinted into a wall that charm couldn't knock down. After I hung up, I sat on my porch watching the sun go down behind my neighbor's maple tree. I expected to feel smug. I expected to feel vindicated. I'd spent years being told Ethan had more potential, more worth, more importance. Now his potential was ripping the family apart. But I didn't feel smug. I felt tired. Because even now, even in crisis, I wasn't a daughter they called. I was a resource they might need. A shadow they'd forgotten but suddenly remembered existed because the house was on fire. Part of me wanted to rush in. Not for Ethan necessarily, but for the little kid in me who still wanted to be counted in a real way. To show them I was capable, necessary, present. Another part of me, the grown woman sitting on a porch she'd paid for, knew that walking back into that dynamic without boundaries would be like stepping into quicksand because someone asked nicely. So I did what I'd learned to do. I paused. I planned. A week later, my father called for the first time in over a year. I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered. My stomach did that old but familiar flip. I answered. His voice was rough, like he'd been grinding it against concrete. He said my name slowly, as if trying it on. He didn't say sorry. He didn't ask how I was. He jumped straight to business, because business was the only language he knew when he was scared. "We need help," he said. "With what?" "Ethan, the companies. The paperwork. We don't understand any of this. People are calling nonstop lawyers. Banks, we're drowning." He was naming my skill set without naming my humanity. It was almost impressive how consistent he was. I breathed in through my nose. "You went to Ethan first, didn't you?" A pause. "Yeah, but he's not handling it. He's making things worse." Another old nerve twanged in me. Potential, I thought. So much potential. I kept my voice steady. What exactly are you asking me to do? He said they needed someone to go through the financial records, figure out what had happened, and help them talk to the lawyers. He said my mother was crying. He said he was afraid they'd lose the house. He said Ethan was still their son and they couldn't just let him fall. He didn't say, "You're my daughter too." He didn't say, "I should have listened to you before." He didn't say, "I'm proud you can do this." But he was asking, and asking in our family was a kind of confession. I told him I'd think about it. He tried to push, tried to guilt, but I stopped him calmly. I said I'd call back tomorrow. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety about the work. I could do the work. I'd been doing harder things since I was 10. I didn't sleep because I was staring down the same old crossroads. Do I save them and disappear again? Or do I help on my terms and finally force the family to look at me? The next morning, I called back. I said yes, but with conditions. 1. I wasn't doing it for Ethan. I was doing it for the truth. If the truth was ugly, nobody got to sweep it under the rug because it was inconvenient. 2. All communication about the case went through me while I was involved. No side deals, no emotional bargains, no parent-child secret pacts. 3. If they wanted my help, they would also have to sit down with me afterward to talk about why I left in the first place. Because I didn't come back to be invisible labor. I came back to be a person in the room. Silence on the other end. Then a stiff yes from my father. I flew home 2 days later. Walking into my parents' house after a year felt like walking into a museum dedicated to a life I'd outgrown. The furniture was the same. The smell of lemon cleaner and old books was the same. Ethan's trophies were still displayed like sacred relics. My childhood photos were still in a drawer. But the house felt smaller. Not physically, emotionally. My mother hugged me too long, too tight, like she was trying to rewind time with her arms. She cried in my shoulder. She called me baby, a name she hadn't used since I was 10 and still believed her attention was a prize I could win. My father stood back like a man who didn't know what to do with regret. Ethan looked thinner, older, a little hollow in the eyes. Not the golden boy now, just a man who'd gambled on his own charisma and lost. He tried to joke when he saw me. The old reflex of charming his way out of guilt. I didn't laugh. I didn't scold either. I just nodded and walked past him into the dining room, where boxes of documents were stacked like a paper avalanche. I spent the next week living in spreadsheet hell. The deeper I went, the worse it got. There were inflated invoices, ghost vendors, transfers between accounts that made no sense unless you were trying to hide something. There were signatures that didn't match. There were emails where Ethan had promised returns he couldn't deliver. Whether it was fraud or incompetence, I couldn't tell at first. Sometimes those two things tell the same story anyway. A lawyer met with us midweek. She was polite but direct. She said investors were preparing a civil suit. She said criminal charges were possible if misrepresentation could be proven. She said my parents needed to stop using personal funds to cover business losses, or they might get dragged into the fallout. My mother looked faint. My father clenched his jaw like he was chewing broken glass. Ethan stared at the table as if it might open and swallow him. When we left the lawyer's office, my father pulled me aside in the driveway. He tried to say thank you. It came out awkward, like a language he'd never learned properly. Then he said something that might have been the most honest thing I'd heard from him. "I didn't know you were this good." I looked at him. "I've been good. You just weren't looking." He flinched. That moment wasn't a Hollywood apology. It wasn't a warm reunion. It was a small crack in a lifetime of denial. And though it didn't fix anything, it mattered. But the rising conflict wasn't just the legal mess. It was what the legal mess was forcing into daylight. Every night at dinner, I watched my parents wrestle with what they'd built around Ethan, the myth of his potential, the habit of protecting him like a fragile heirloom, the way they still wanted to blame the world before they blamed him. I watched Ethan, too, confronting a version of himself he couldn't talk his way out of. I saw him slip between defensiveness and despair, anger and shame. He was still the family's center of gravity, but gravity feels different when you're falling. As I untangled the numbers, a narrative formed. Ethan hadn't set out to be a villain. He'd set out to be admired, to be the hero my parents always told him he was. He'd overpromised, panicked, patched things with lies. Then patched the lies with more lies until the whole thing became a web too thick to escape. It was a tragedy in slow motion. And even as I worked to keep my parents from losing everything, I couldn't ignore the bigger truth. This mess existed in part because nobody had ever made Ethan face consequences. Nobody had ever let him be ordinary. He'd been raised like a small prince. Princes don't learn how to fail safely. They learn how to hide failure until it explodes. By the end of the week, I had a full report. A timeline, evidence, a clean narrative for the lawyers. It wasn't good news, but it was the truth. The lawyers said we needed a formal meeting with the investors' representatives, something like a boardroom mediation. They needed to see that the family was taking accountability, that there was a plan, that Ethan wasn't still out there pretending everything was fine. The meeting was scheduled for Monday. All weekend, my mother paced. My father barely ate. Ethan disappeared into his room for hours. I sat at the kitchen table reviewing my notes and felt something strange. Not fear, not excitement, just clarity. Monday wasn't only about numbers. It was about whether I was going to stay the invisible second pancake or finally demand the seat I'd earned. The mediation was held in a glass conference room downtown, in a building that smelled like money and nervous cologne. One long table, a neutral mediator at the head, 2 investors on one side with their legal team. Our side was smaller. 1 lawyer, my parents, Ethan. And me, I wore a navy suit that fit like armor. I could feel the investors sizing us up. They looked at Ethan with the kind of cold contempt you reserve for people who waste your time. They looked at my parents like collateral damage. They glanced at me and then away, because to them I was just another person in the room, not the axis this meeting would turn on. The mediator began laying out the ground rules, the goal, the timeline. Everyone nodded politely. Legal theater. The investor's lead attorney spoke first. His voice was clipped, his words rehearsed. He listed losses, broken promises, and misleading reports. He laid out a demand for repayment and hinted at escalation if they didn't see real accountability. My father started to respond, but his voice shook and his words tangled. My mother quietly cried into a tissue. Ethan tried to jump in with explanations that sounded like excuses by the second sentence. I let them speak for a while. Then I leaned forward and placed my report on the table. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just factual. I introduced myself, stated my role, and walked the room through the financial reality. I didn't sugarcoat. I didn't scapegoat. I didn't perform for sympathy. I outlined where money went, where promises exceeded capacity, where records were altered to cover gaps. The investor's lawyer tried to interrupt. I kept going with calm precision. The mediator asked questions. I answered with evidence. My parents stared at me like they were seeing a stranger and a daughter at the same time. Ethan's face drained as the story of his choices became something other people could see, not just something he could spin. Then came the breaking point. One of the investors, a gray-haired woman with a sharp jaw, looked directly at Ethan and said something along the lines of how his recklessness had ruined trust, and how he'd been handed opportunities most people never get. Ethan snapped back defensively, and my father, of all people, turned to defend him, starting to say that Ethan was under pressure, that he was a good kid, that he meant well. Before he could finish, I put a hand up gently. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't glare. I just stopped the old pattern in its tracks. I said we weren't going to excuse anything anymore. Not here, not now, not ever again. I said Ethan had made choices, and those choices had consequences. And the only way forward was to tell the truth without decorating it. There was a long silence, the kind of silence that makes your heartbeat sound loud. My father looked at me like I'd just committed some kind of mutiny. My mother looked terrified. Ethan looked furious. But the mediator nodded, and the investors leaned in, because for the first time someone on our side was speaking like an adult. Not a parent protecting a child, not a child protecting his ego. Just a person telling the truth. We negotiated for hours. The terms weren't easy. There would be repayments. There would be asset freezes. There would be a restructuring that essentially removed Ethan from control of anything financial. He would have to cooperate fully with audits. If he didn't, things could still go criminal. When it ended, we walked out of that glass room into the hallway. My mother was shaky with relief and grief mixed together. My father looked like he'd aged 10 years in one morning. Ethan pulled me aside. He was angry. Yes, but underneath it was something else. Raw fear. He asked why I'd embarrassed him like that. I told him I didn't embarrass him. His actions did. I just stopped lying about them. He stared at me, jaw working, not sure how to fit me into his old story of who I was. Then, quietly, he said he didn't know I had it in me. I almost laughed, because there it was again. The family's favorite surprise, me being competent. I told him I'd always had it in me. He just wasn't looking. We went back to my parents' house afterward. Dinner was silent, not hostile, just stunned. Like a storm had passed through and nobody knew what to do with the debris. That night, I sat alone in the living room where Ethan's trophies still stood. I looked at them differently now. Not as evidence he was loved more, but as evidence of how much pressure they'd all put on the narrative of his greatness. And I realized this was the real breaking point. Not the investors. Not the money. The breaking point was that the family fantasy had finally collapsed, and I was standing in the doorway of whatever came next. Dear audience, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps. The legal fallout didn't wrap up neatly. Real life never does. But after the mediation, we weren't free-falling anymore. We had a plan, even if it was a painful one. Over the next few months, I stayed involved remotely. I coordinated with lawyers. I helped my parents separate personal finances from the business mess. I found a reputable accountant to oversee the restructuring. I did the work I'd said I would do. But I didn't dissolve back into my old role. That was the quiet revolution. My parents called me directly now, not just for updates, but for opinions, for explanations, for reassurance. My mother started asking about my job. My father started asking how my life was and waiting long enough to hear the full answer. They didn't become different people overnight. Change doesn't happen like a light switch. It happens like a muscle you haven't used in years. Clumsy at first, sore, uncertain. There were awkward conversations. One evening, my mother sat with me at the kitchen table and said she hadn't realized how lonely I'd been growing up. She said she thought being low maintenance meant I was okay. She said she was sorry in that quiet, shaken way people apologize when they've finally understood the damage. I didn't forgive her instantly. Forgiveness isn't a vending machine. You don't put in an apology and get a clean slate. But I let her words land. I let the space between us breathe. My father apologized too, in his own stiff way. He admitted he'd placed all his hopes on Ethan and assumed I didn't need the same kind of belief. He said he'd been wrong. Again, not a Hollywood speech. Just a man trying to learn a new map for a life he'd already lived too far into. Ethan's part was messier. He went through phases: shame, anger, numbness, then what looked like actual reflection. He had to take a job beneath the glamorous identity he'd always chased. He had to show up to meetings where nobody cared about his charisma. He had to face a world that didn't treat him like a special case. In a strange way, I think the collapse saved him. Not from consequences, but from the lifelong lie that he'd never have to meet them. One afternoon, about 6 months after the mediation, he showed up at the house while I was visiting. He looked steadier, not triumphant, just real. He told me he'd read my letter. My stomach tightened. He said he'd never understood what it felt like to be second because the family had made sure he never had to. He said he'd always assumed I was fine. He said he was sorry. I didn't throw confetti. I didn't melt. I just nodded and said I was glad he could see it now. We weren't best friends after that. We didn't suddenly become a sitcom closed sibling pair. But something shifted. He stopped expecting me to catch him. He started treating me like a person with her own gravity. After a year, most of the worst financial damage was contained. My parents downsized a bit to protect what they could. Ethan paid back what he could. The business itself was sold in pieces. It was a loss, but not an apocalypse. Then came the part I didn't expect. My parents asked me to come home for a family dinner on my birthday. Not a dinner that happened to include me while focusing on Ethan. A dinner for me. My mother cooked my favorite meal from childhood. My father bought a cake. Ethan brought a small gift and didn't make it about himself. We sat at the table and my father raised his glass to me. He said he was proud of the woman I'd become. He said he wished he'd said it sooner. He said I was the reason they didn't lose everything. I didn't cry at the table. I waited until later in my old bedroom, when the house was quiet and I could feel the weight of that sentence without needing to protect it with composure. Because being seen late is still being seen. And even if it doesn't erase the past, it changes the shape of the future. When I flew back to my house and my life, I didn't feel like I'd gone back. I felt like I'd returned briefly and stayed myself. That was the redemption. Not that they paid me back. Not that Ethan fell. Not that I became some triumphant hero. But that I learned the difference between helping and disappearing. And I chose myself without abandoning my humanity. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every week.